It sits on nearly every grocery shelf in America. Red on top, white on the bottom. A medallion pressed into the center of the label, placed there after the Paris Exposition of 1900 and never removed. The design has barely changed since 1898. Andy Warhol turned it into fine art. Thanksgiving tables across the country still depend on its cream of mushroom for the casserole. The Campbell soup can might be the single most recognized food product in the history of the United States, but behind that familiar label is a dynasty most Americans know nothing about. A chemist who earned $7.50 a week and died owning the entire company. A fortune so large that 2 states went to war over the right to tax it. A grandson who packed his bags, planted trees in Ireland, and walked into the American embassy in Dublin to renounce his citizenship forever. And a family, now scattered across 3 countries, still holding billions of dollars in stock they were ordered never to sell. This is not a story about soup. This is a story about what one invention can do to a bloodline. Chapter 1. The $7 Chemist. In 1869, a fruit merchant named Joseph Campbell and an icebox manufacturer named Abraham Anderson opened a small canning operation in Camden, New Jersey. They packed tomatoes, vegetables, jellies, and minced meat. The business was modest. Anderson left within a few years. Campbell carried on, and in 1894, after nearly 3 decades, he retired. A man named Arthur Dorrance had by then risen to the presidency of the company. Under Arthur, the operation was stable, profitable enough. They canned beefsteak tomatoes and sold them regionally. In 1895, the company introduced its first ready-to-eat soup. It sold reasonably well. Nothing about the business suggested it was about to become one of the most valuable food companies on earth. Then Arthur's nephew showed up. John Thompson Dorrance was born on November 11, 1873, in Bristol, Pennsylvania. He came from a family with means. The young Dorrance was sharp, restless, and consumed by chemistry. He earned a Bachelor of Science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1895, then sailed to Germany to pursue a doctorate at the University of Göttingen. While abroad, he spent time in Paris, eating in restaurants, studying the soups. He noticed something that struck him. Europeans treated soup as an essential part of their daily meals. Americans, by and large, did not. Dorrance believed the reason was practical. In the United States, prepared soups were expensive, heavy, and sold in oversized cans. If someone could fix those problems, the market was wide open. After completing his doctorate in 1897, Dorrance received teaching offers from Columbia, Cornell, Bryn Mawr, and Göttingen itself. He declined all 4. Instead, he went to Camden and asked his uncle for a position at the factory. Arthur was skeptical. His nephew was too much the scholar, he thought, not the kind of man who would find purpose packing fruits and vegetables for a living. But John was persistent. He offered to accept a salary of $7.50 per week and to equip his own laboratory out of pocket. His uncle gave in. It turned out to be the most consequential hiring decision in the history of the American food industry. Dorrance built a small lab inside the Camden plant and set to work. His thinking was elegant. Canned soup at the time was sold in 32-ounce containers, most of which was water. A single can weighed several pounds and cost a housewife more than 30 cents. The water made it expensive to can, expensive to ship, and expensive to shelve. Dorrance intended to remove the water entirely. By cooking soup down to a concentrated form, he could preserve the same flavor and nutrition in a can roughly 1/3 the size. The customer would add water at home. The savings in production, freight, and storage were enormous. A can of soup that once cost more than 30 cents could now sell for 10. He developed the formula in 1897. Within 2 years, the first cans of Campbell's condensed soup were on store shelves. The original variety was tomato. It sold immediately. By the early 1900s, the company offered 21 varieties, everyone priced at a dime. Dorrance was a scientist, but he was not only a scientist. He paid attention to how things looked. In 1898, a company executive named Herberton Williams attended the annual Cornell versus Penn football game and returned captivated by the vivid red and white of Cornell's new uniforms. Williams persuaded the company to abandon its existing black and orange label in favor of that same color pairing. It was a change born from a Saturday afternoon football game, and it produced a brand identity that has endured for more than a century. 2 years later, Campbell's entered a soup competition at the 1900 Paris International Exposition. The company's representatives did not bring a chef. They packed cans of condensed soup in their luggage, prepared them on site, and won a bronze medal for product excellence. Dorrance had the medal printed onto the label. It has been there for more than 125 years. In 1904, a Philadelphia artist named Grace Drayton sketched a pair of rosy-cheeked children for a series of streetcar advertisements. The Campbell kids became an advertising fixture that would outlast nearly every campaign of its era. Drayton's illustrations gave the brand a personality that no soup can, however well designed, could have achieved alone. Meanwhile, Dorrance was steadily acquiring power. He became a director and vice president in 1900, and from that point forward he used every dollar he could find to purchase stock from his uncle and other partners. Inside the company, the understanding was plain. Dorrance knew the recipes. He had engineered the process. If the other shareholders refused his offers, he could walk out the door, set up a rival operation, and destroy them. Whether the threat was ever stated directly is unclear, but the result was not. Share by share, year after year, John Thompson Dorrance was buying his way to total ownership. When Arthur retired in 1914, his nephew succeeded him as president. The following year, Dorrance purchased the remaining interest held by the Campbell family and became the company's sole proprietor. The man who had arrived at $7.50 a week now controlled an enterprise that was redefining the American kitchen. He was 42 years old, and he was only getting started. Chapter 2, Red, White, and 10 Cents. By 1904, the Campbell factory was producing 16 million cans of soup a year. The operation that had once packed tomatoes and jellies for a regional market was becoming something else entirely. John Dorrance had reshaped it in his image. He was not interested in preserves. He was not interested in ketchup. He wanted to sell soup, and he wanted to sell it to the entire country. He began by cutting away everything that distracted from that goal. The jams, the condiments, the pickled goods were phased out. Dorrance believed that a company trying to do too many things would do none of them well. Campbell would make soup. It would make it better than anyone else. And it would make sure that every household in America knew the name. In 1906, Dorrance married Ethel Malincrot in Baltimore. She came from a prominent Maryland family. Together they would have 5 children, 4 daughters, Eleanor, Ethel, Charlotte, and Margaret, and 1 son, John Jr., born in 1919. The marriage placed Dorrance in the social world of the Eastern establishment. But he was not a man built for leisure. He was at the factory before dawn, involved in every detail of the operation, from the varieties of tomatoes grown on the company's research farms to the wording of a streetcar advertisement. In 1911, Campbell's Soups reached California for the first time. Distributing a perishable product across 3,000 miles of rail lines and warehouses was a genuine logistical achievement in the early 20th century. Campbell became one of the first food companies to serve the entire nation. Dorrance pressed forward. In 1912, he launched an agricultural program, putting the company in the business of growing its own tomatoes. He wanted to control quality from the seed to the shelf. During the 8 summer weeks of the harvest, the entire plant was devoted to processing tomatoes into soup and juice. Nothing else was produced until the crop was in. In 1915, he acquired the Franco-American Food Company, a New Jersey producer of canned pasta and soups that had been in operation since 1886. Franco-American had been the first company in America to manufacture canned soup commercially. Dorrance did not buy it to preserve its soup line. He bought it to absorb a competitor and take its distribution network. The Franco-American name was gradually retired from soup products and reassigned to pasta. In 1922, the company was reincorporated under a new name. It had been the Joseph Campbell Company. Now it was the Campbell Soup Company. The word soup, placed directly in the corporate identity, was a declaration. This was not a general-purpose canning operation. Dorrance wanted there to be no confusion on the matter. By the late 1920s, Campbell was selling more soup than any company in the world. During the war years, nearly half of the company's sales had come from just two products: tomato soup and tomato juice. By the time the decade turned, the product lineup had expanded far beyond tomatoes, but the underlying model had not changed. One formula, one can, a price that nearly anyone could afford. Dorrance sat on the boards of banks and railroads, held memberships in scientific societies on both sides of the Atlantic, and had received the French Legion of Honor. He was, by any measure, among the wealthiest men in the United States, and he was about to make the single most expensive mistake of his life. Chapter 3: Woodcrest. By 1925, John Thompson Dorrance was generating more wealth than he could reasonably spend. His company sold soup in every state in the Union, and the fortune was still growing. He decided to buy a house that matched it. The property was called Woodcrest. It sat on 238 acres in Radnor Township, on the Philadelphia Main Line, surrounded by the estates of bankers, railroad magnates, and old-money families who had been there for generations. The house itself was a 51-room Elizabethan Tudor mansion, 3 stories of local stone and limestone trim with half-timbered wings, designed at the turn of the century by Horace Trumbauer, the most sought-after residential architect in Philadelphia. Trumbauer had built mansions for the Wideners, the Elkinses, and the Stotesburys. Woodcrest was his commission for James W. Paul Jr., a managing partner at Drexel and Company, and the son-in-law of financier Anthony Drexel. Dorrance paid approximately $1 million for the estate, including renovations and furnishings. He had the dark Victorian interiors stripped out and replaced with lighter Elizabethan finishes. The second floor held 10 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms for the family and their guests, with 12 additional rooms and 2 baths for the household staff. The third floor had 5 more bedrooms, a nursery, and 2 baths. Out on the grounds stood a stable, a pool house, a milk house, a cow barn, and a garage built for 7 automobiles. On November 14, 1925, the Dorrance family moved in. Every piece of personal property was transported from their previous home in Cinnaminson, New Jersey. The children enrolled in local schools. Their social life, their friendships, their daily existence, all of it shifted to Radnor. This was not a country retreat. This was a relocation. 16 servants staffed the house. 10 to 12 more worked the grounds. Dorrance entertained frequently and lavishly. His wife Ethel, who had waited years for the family's wealth to translate into social standing, hosted teas and garden parties that drew admiring coverage in the society pages. When their eldest daughter Eleanor made her debut, one columnist described the occasion as one of the most beautiful teas of the season. The Dorrances had arrived on the main line, and they intended to stay, but not officially. Dorrance understood something about money that many of his neighbors did not. New Jersey, where the Campbell factory sat and where the family had lived since 1911, taxed inherited wealth at a far lower rate than Pennsylvania. If Dorrance died as a Pennsylvania resident, his family would owe the Commonwealth an enormous sum on a fortune already exceeding $100 million. So he kept Cinnaminson alive. The old house was a plain brick structure with a mansard roof, sitting on about 7 acres surrounded by truck farms. His own wife would later describe it under oath as ordinary and very ugly. But Dorrance maintained the fiction that it was still his home. He kept his voter registration in New Jersey. His driver's license was issued there. He banked there. His attorneys practiced there. His will, when he eventually wrote it, declared him a resident of Cinnaminson Township, Burlington County, and required his executors, under penalty, to file it for probate in that state. The deception was meticulous, but the numbers told a different story. Before the move, Dorrance had employed 10 servants at Cinnaminson. Afterward, the number dropped to 4. After his mother and sister both died at Cinnaminson in the late 1920s, the staff fell to 2. Household spending at the New Jersey property plummeted from nearly $29,000 a year to roughly $6,500. The monthly gas and electric bill at Cinnaminson came to about $7. Dorrance visited occasionally. The property adjoined the company's experimental tomato farms, and he had practical reasons to stop by. But none of this altered the central fact. From November 1925 until the day he died, the Dorrance family lived at Woodcrest. Everything else was performance. In the evenings, Dorrance sat in a house built for a Drexel, ran a company that made him wealthier every quarter, and drank. Multiple accounts suggest he drank heavily, a habit his son would later inherit. He refused every approach from investment bankers who wanted to take the company public. Time magazine would later note that many a banker's mouth had watered at the thought of bringing such an enterprise to market. Not one ever managed to get a meeting. Dorrance wanted no outside ownership. He wanted no scrutiny. He was willing to maintain a $7 electricity bill in a house he barely visited to protect a fortune that would outlast him by a century. He was 56 years old. He had written a will that ran to 35 pages. The scheme he had built so carefully was 5 years from collapse, and the bill would come to more than $30 million. Chapter 4: Death and the Double Tax. John Thompson Dorrance died on September 21, 1930, of heart disease. He was 56 years old. He did not die at Woodcrest. He died at Cinnaminson. The family had spent part of that summer at Bar Harbor, Maine, where they kept a third residence. When they returned in the early fall, Woodcrest was being prepared for the season. So Dorrance stopped at the old house in New Jersey, the one his wife had called ordinary and very ugly. It was there, in the place he had spent years pretending was still his home, that his heart gave out. His executors did exactly what his will instructed. They filed the document for probate in Burlington County, New Jersey, identifying the deceased as a resident of Cinnaminson Township. His brother Arthur succeeded him as president of the Campbell Soup Company. The body was taken across the state line and buried at West Laurel Hill Cemetery in Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania. And then the letters arrived. Pennsylvania moved first. The Commonwealth claimed that Dorrance had been domiciled in Radnor Township from the moment his family moved into Woodcrest in 1925. It appointed an appraiser who valued the estate at just under $200 million and assessed an inheritance tax of $31,465,000. The executors fought it. They appealed to the Orphans' Court of Delaware County, which sided with them and threw out the assessment. Pennsylvania took the case to the state Supreme Court, and in September of 1932, that court reversed the lower ruling. Dorrance, it held, had been domiciled in Pennsylvania. The evidence was overwhelming. The 51 rooms, the 16 servants, the children in local schools, the social life conducted entirely from Radnor, his declarations, his voter registration, his driver's license, none of it mattered. A man's conduct, the court ruled, speaks louder than his paperwork. The executors asked the United States Supreme Court to intervene. It declined. They paid Pennsylvania $14,394,000 plus interest, plus a $4 million bond against additional amounts that might come due. Then New Jersey made its claim. The state had its own evidence. Dorrance had voted there, banked there, run his company from Camden, and insisted in his own will that he was a citizen of New Jersey. The tax commissioner assessed an inheritance tax of $12,247,000 on an estate valued at over $115 million. The executors argued that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had already settled the question. You cannot tax a man twice for the privilege of dying. New Jersey disagreed. Its prerogative court upheld the assessment in 1934. Its Supreme Court affirmed in early 1935. Both courts held that the Pennsylvania ruling was not binding. Each state had the right to determine domicile for itself, and New Jersey determined that Dorrance belonged to them. The executors went back to the United States Supreme Court. In December of 1935, Justice Louis Brandeis delivered the opinion. The court would not intervene. The federal judiciary had no authority to enjoin a state tax proceeding already working its way through state courts. John Thompson Dorrance, who had spent the last 5 years of his life maintaining a legal fiction to protect his fortune, ended up domiciled in 2 states simultaneously. Pennsylvania collected over $14 million. New Jersey collected over $12 million. The combined bill came to more than $26 million, Had he simply chosen one state and declared it honestly, the figure would have been roughly half. The case became a landmark in American tax law, studied in classrooms and cited in courthouses for the rest of the century. It established that two states can each claim a decedent, each tax the estate, and neither is required to defer to the other. Nearly 100 years later, estate planners still use the Dorrance case as a warning. He had built a fortune on the principle of removing what was unnecessary: water from soup, distractions from a product line, partners from a company. But in the matter of his own death, he had added something that did not need to be there: a second home maintained for no purpose other than deception, and it doubled the bill. He left behind a will. What it contained would bind the Dorrance family and the Campbell Soup Company for the rest of the 20th century. Chapter 5. The 35-page Will. The will was read in Mount Holly, New Jersey. The heirs learned that John Thompson Dorrance had divided his fortune into 6 parts. His wife Ethel received 1/4. His only son, John Jr., known as Jack, received 1/4, along with his father's personal library and a grandfather clock. The 4 daughters, Eleanor, Ethel, Charlotte, and Margaret, each received 1/8. Even 1/8 of the Dorrance estate was a sum most men would never see in a lifetime. At the time the will was filed, the total fortune was estimated at $150 million. But the money was not the point. The stock was. Dorrance had spent his life refusing every offer to sell or dilute his ownership of the Campbell Soup Company. In death, he intended to continue that refusal. The will instructed his executors in the strongest possible language not to sell the company's shares. If a sale were ever found necessary, it was to come only after what Dorrance called the greatest deliberation, and every share was to be sold in a single block. No piecemeal liquidation, no outside investors acquiring a foothold one transaction at a time. The structure went deeper. When each of Dorrance's children eventually died, the stock would not simply pass to their spouses or be absorbed into other estates. It would flow to their children, his grandchildren, and Jack's heirs, as a group, would receive double the allotment given to the heirs of each daughter. The will guaranteed that the male line, the one carrying the Dorrance name, would always hold the largest share. There was another calculation behind the choice of New Jersey residency that went beyond inheritance tax rates. Under Pennsylvania law, a widow was entitled to 1/3 of her husband's personal property, regardless of what the will said. New Jersey had no such provision. By maintaining the fiction of Cinnamonson, Dorrance ensured that Ethel would receive exactly what he chose to give her, and not $1 more. He had even asked her to sign a statement before his death, confirming that their legal residence was New Jersey. The will was not a gesture of generosity. It was an instrument of control. It told the family what to own, how to own it, and what would happen if they disobeyed. It created a structure that would hold for decades, binding children who were still in school and grandchildren who had not yet been born. Jack Dorrance was 11 years old. The Philadelphia Record called him the nearest thing to a reigning earl or duke that we have in this nation. He had just inherited 1/4 of the largest privately held food company in America, a grandfather clock, and a set of instructions that would govern the rest of his life. Chapter 6. The Prince and the Prisoner. The boy who inherited the soup company grew up knowing exactly what he was. At Princeton, he drove a car fitted with tear gas jets, a precaution against kidnapping. Decades later, as chairman of Campbell, he traveled a different route to the office every day, trailed by bodyguards. Jack Dorrance came to Princeton from St. George's School in Newport, Rhode Island, majored in geology, and graduated in the class of 1941. He enlisted in the Signal Corps, served in China, and rose from private to captain. After the war, he reported to the factory floor in Camden. His father had not intended for him to run the company. The will gave him ownership, not authority. The old man had seen too many heirs fail in the executive chair, and the structure he left behind reflected that caution. Campbell was led first by Jack's uncle Arthur, and then by a series of non-family executives. Jack spent more than a decade working through the ranks, serving as a floor foreman, an assistant treasurer, and an aide to the president before he was named chairman of the board in 1962. He held the position for 22 years. During that time, Campbell sold stock to the public for the first time in 1954 and expanded into frozen foods, restaurants, and international markets. But Jack did not see himself as a builder. He was a guardian of what his father had created. One friend put it simply: Jack felt conscious that his father had made the money, and he had not. He did not find great joy in being rich. He found it as embarrassing as it was fun. Jack married twice. His first marriage ended in divorce in 1963. He remarried and settled in Gladwin on the Main Line. He had 3 children, a son named John Thompson Dorrance III, known since childhood as Ippy, and 2 younger children, Mary Alice and Bennett. All 3 attended the University of Arizona. Their photographs were absent from their yearbooks. Jack was private, and he drank, carrying forward a pattern his father had set. He told his children almost nothing about the company or the fortune that awaited them. In 1984, he surprised shareholders at the annual meeting by announcing, in a single offhand sentence, that he would step down as chairman. He remained on the board and stayed active at the headquarters. 5 years later, on April 9, 1989, he died of a heart attack at his home in Bryn Mawr. He was 70 years old. His 3 children went from receiving quarterly trust distributions to holding direct ownership of roughly 1/3 of the Campbell Soup Company. The fortune their grandfather had locked inside a 35-page will now belong to them. Chapter 7. The Clan Without a Leader. Jack Dorrance had tried in his final years to prepare the next generation. In March of 1989, he gathered his children, nieces, and nephews at the Greenbrier Hotel in West Virginia for a 3-day retreat. Part family reunion, part business seminar. The heirs toured the operations, asked questions, mingled with executives. Jack watched from a distance and felt, for the first time, cautiously hopeful. He was dead less than 2 weeks later. The 9 Dorrance cousins who now controlled a majority of the Campbell Soup Company were not a unified family. They were 3 separate branches with separate grievances. Jack's children, Ippy, Mary Alice, and Bennett, held the largest combined stake. The older cousins, Dorrance Hamilton and Hope Van Buren, descended from Jack's sister Eleanor, held a smaller but significant share. A third group, the descendants of the other sisters, fell somewhere in between. Much of the family's wealth was locked in Campbell stock they had inherited free of tax. But the stock was also a trap. Earnings had been flat for years under a CEO, whose expansion strategy had produced little return. The cousins who wanted to sell faced a practical reality. If enough of them dumped their shares on the open market, the price would collapse. The only way to extract full value was to sell the company itself. Within months of Jack's death, a secret merger plan emerged. It was called Project Toad. The idea began casually on a ski trip in Vail, when a family member mentioned to a neighbor that Campbell needed a new chief executive. The neighbor suggested the head of Quaker Oats. From that chance conversation came a proposal that would have merged Campbell with Quaker Oats to create the second largest food company in America, behind only Philip Morris. It would also have moved the headquarters to Chicago and reduced the Dorrance family from majority owners to minority shareholders. When Ippy, Bennett, and their cousin George Strawbridge learned what was being negotiated without their consent, they placed a conference call to the chairman and killed it. Toad was dead, but the rift was not. 3 dissident families, holding about 17% of the stock, filed papers with the Securities and Exchange Commission signaling their intent to sell. They hired Arthur Lyman, the Manhattan lawyer who had interrogated Oliver North during the Iran-Contra hearings, and sent him to Campbell headquarters with a message: "Find a way to satisfy everyone, or we force a sale." Jack's 3 children held firm. They controlled enough stock to block any transaction. But blocking a sale was not the same as fixing a company. Campbell needed a new direction, and the family needed someone outside the bloodline to provide it. In late 1989, the board recruited David W. Johnson, an Australian-born executive who had previously turned around Gerber Products. Johnson restructured operations, closed underperforming businesses, and within 2 years had improved earnings enough to quiet the dissidents. By January of 1990, the immediate crisis had passed. The dissidents never changed their minds, but for the moment, the center held. Ippy, Mary Alice, and Bennett had done what their grandfather's will had demanded of them. They had refused to sell. What none of them could have predicted was that the eldest of the three, the rancher from Wyoming who had fought hardest to keep the company in the family, would soon make a decision that had nothing to do with Campbell Soup and everything to do with the fortune behind it. Chapter 8. The Rancher. John Thompson. Dorrance III was not raised to be a businessman. His parents divorced when he was 19, and his mother took him to Switzerland. He returned to the United States for college, enrolled at the University of Arizona, earned a degree in business, and then did something no Dorrance had done before. He disappeared. He bought a ranch near Devil's Tower in eastern Wyoming. 18,000 acres of open grassland, far from Camden, far from the main line, far from the family name. He raised Brangus cattle under the brand IPY, a shortened version of his childhood nickname. Ippy, as everyone called him, had been trying to pronounce the Roman numeral after his name as a small boy, and the sound stuck. For 15 years, he lived as a rancher. He married a woman named Gundel Sobek and had 2 sons. His home was a 3-story chalet filled with mounted game. He was comfortable, but not wealthy in any way the Dorrance name would suggest. His father's trust provided a quarterly stipend of $100,000. It was a generous sum by any ordinary measure, but it bore no resemblance to the fortune that sat locked in Campbell Soup stock, waiting for Jack to die. When his father's heart stopped in 1989, everything changed. Ippy's share of the company was suddenly worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His income jumped to $87,000 a day in dividends alone. He joined the Campbell board and surprised everyone. He was intense, unpredictable, and deeply engaged. He flew at his own expense to inspect operations in Hong Kong, Spain, and Argentina. One director described it simply. For Ippy, it was a mission. He had fought to keep the company in the family. He had helped kill Project Toad, and now he was staring at a tax code that would, upon his death, take more than half of everything he had just inherited. Chapter 9. The Irish Passport. The math was straightforward. Under American law, when Ippy Dorrance died, his estate would owe the federal government 55% of its value in estate taxes. On a fortune measured in hundreds of millions, that meant his children would lose more than half their inheritance to the Internal Revenue Service. His grandfather had tried to game the system by maintaining a fake address in New Jersey. It had cost the family $34 million. Ippy chose a different approach. He decided to leave the country. In the early 1990s, he invested $1.5 million to plant trees on roughly 1,000 acres of land in Ireland. Under Irish law at the time, foreign nationals who made qualifying investments in the country could apply for citizenship. Dorrance met the requirements. In 1995, he appeared before an Irish judge, swore his fidelity, and became a citizen of the Republic of Ireland. Then he walked into the United States Embassy in Dublin and signed a 1-page document renouncing his American nationality. The consequences were immediate and deliberate. In Ireland, the estate tax rate was 2%. Dorrance could still visit his Wyoming ranch, which he had transferred to his sons 2 years earlier. He could still attend Campbell board meetings in Camden, but he could not spend more than 120 days a year on American soil without risking taxation as a resident. In November of 1996, he sold his Campbell Soup shares. The transaction was worth $720 million. He settled into a Georgian townhouse in Dublin, spent winters at a private estate in Lyford Cay in the Bahamas, and largely vanished from public life. Washington reacted with fury. Representative Patricia Schroeder attacked him from the floor of the House. President Clinton proposed an exit tax aimed specifically at wealthy Americans who renounced their citizenship to avoid estate taxes. Ippy Dorrance became the most prominent example of a new kind of American emigrant, not someone fleeing persecution or poverty, but someone fleeing the tax code. The irony was difficult to miss. 65 years earlier, his grandfather had maintained a house he never lived in to avoid a state inheritance tax. It had backfired spectacularly. Now the grandson had abandoned an entire country for the same reason. The instinct was identical, only the scale had changed. Chapter 10. The Horsewoman. While Ippy was preparing to leave the country, his sister was doing the opposite. Mary Alice Dorrance Malone stayed in Pennsylvania, stayed on the board, and stayed in the saddle. She was born on February 3, 1950, the middle child of Jack Dorrance and his wife Angeline. She grew up in Chester County, surrounded by rolling farmland and old money, and joined the Bridle Wild Pony Club in Gladwin as a girl. The bond she formed with horses in those early years never loosened. By her 20s, she was running a boarding and training facility in Arizona, coaching young riders, and founding both the Tucson Dressage Club and the Saguaro Pony Club. In 1976, she returned to Pennsylvania and founded Iron Spring Farm in Coatesville. European warmbloods were still largely unknown in the United States, and American breeders had little access to the bloodlines that dominated international dressage. Mary Alice changed that. She began importing Dutch warmblood stallions from the Netherlands, and over the next 4 decades she brought some of the most influential sport horse sires in the world to American soil. Romer, who excelled at both Grand Prix jumping and dressage, became one of the most recognized stallions in the country. She later established the Romer Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting dressage education across the United States. Winston, Sebastian, Consul, and Contango followed. Contango alone won 33 Grand Prix events and multiple national championships. Mary Alice was not simply a breeder who watched from the fence line. She competed. With a stallion named Rampal, she earned a place on the United States Olympic shortlist and helped prove that American-bred horses could perform at the highest international level. Over the course of her career, she accumulated more than 87 victories at the Grand Prix level, earned her bronze, silver, and gold medals from the United States Dressage Federation, and won top honors at the Royal Dressage Festival and the USET Festival of Champions. She was among the first to import approved Friesian stallions for high-performance dressage at a time when the breed was rarely seen in international competition. In early 2025, the Royal Warmblood Stud Book of the Netherlands honored her with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Iron Spring Farm eventually expanded to include a winter facility in Wellington, Florida. The horses she bred and imported went on to compete at the Olympics, the Paralympics, and the FEY World Cup Dressage Final. Their offspring won medals at World Driving Championships and performed at Aachen, Hickstead, and Spruce Meadows. What had started as a single farm in Coatesville became one of the most respected equestrian breeding programs in the world. But horses were only half of her life. The other half belonged to Camden. Mary Alice was elected to the Campbell Board of Directors in 1990, 1 year after her father died. She served longer than any other director in the company's history. Her 18% stake made her the single largest individual shareholder, and Forbes valued her fortune at $4.1 billion. She sat on the governance and compensation committees, attended meetings with the quiet consistency of someone who understood that her presence was not ceremonial. It was structural. As long as Mary Alice Malone held her shares and her seat, the Dorrance family retained its grip on the company. She was intensely private. She gave almost no interviews and made no public statements about the family conflicts of the late 1980s. When a former cook and traveling companion named Agnes O'Brien attempted to extort her in 2009, threatening to publish a tell-all book about her personal life unless she paid $1 million, Mary Alice went straight to the authorities. The FBI investigated. O'Brien was arrested in August of 2010, charged with extortion, and pleaded guilty the following May. Mary Alice said nothing publicly about the matter. She never commented on the case, never issued a statement, never acknowledged the episode in any forum. The silence was deliberate and total. She had 2 daughters, Mary Alice Malone Jr. and Catherine Dorrance Malone. She raised them in the same Chester County countryside where she had grown up, among the same hills and horse farms that had shaped her own childhood. Mary Alice Dorrance Malone died peacefully at home on June 16, 2025. She was 75 years old. The Campbell's company described her as a highly committed director whose knowledge of the company's history and culture was invaluable. Within weeks, her eldest daughter was appointed to fill her seat on the board. The transition was seamless. The seat passed the way a title passes in an old European house, not because it was owed, but because someone had to hold it. The money was inherited. The horses were chosen. Chapter 11. The Default Leader. Bennett Dorrance was the youngest of Jack's 3 children, and in many ways the least visible. He did not breed Olympic horses. He did not renounce his citizenship. He moved to Arizona after college and stayed there, building a life that looked nothing like the Dorrance name would suggest. In the early 1980s, he co-founded DMB Associates, a real estate development firm based in Scottsdale. The company built master-planned residential communities and commercial properties across Arizona, California, and Utah. It was successful, respected in the industry, and entirely unrelated to soup. Bennett had no interest in running Campbell's, but he understood, better than most of his relatives, that someone in the family had to keep the coalition together. He joined the Campbell board in 1989, the same year his father died. He was in his early 30s. The company was in crisis. Cousins were threatening to sell. A secret merger with Quaker Oats had just been killed. The family voting trust was dissolving. Bennett stepped into this chaos not as a deal-maker or a corporate strategist, but as a mediator. He held a 15% stake in the company, and he used it the way a diplomat uses leverage. Quietly, consistently, and without drawing attention to himself. At a family business conference in the mid-1990s, Bennett described his role in terms that no one in the audience would have envied. He called himself the default leader of the Dorrance family. No one else could do it, he said, and no one else was interested. The title was not flattering. It was accurate. Ippy had left the country. Mary Alice was focused on her horses and her board seat. The cousins from the other branches of the family were scattered, some disengaged, some actively hostile. Bennett was the one who made the phone calls, arranged the meetings, and worked to keep the 33% family stake voting as a block rather than fragmenting into a dozen competing interests. He lived in Paradise Valley, a wealthy enclave tucked against Camelback Mountain on the eastern edge of Phoenix. His life there was comfortable, but deliberately low profile. He avoided the press. He did not appear on magazine covers or celebrity wealth lists with the same frequency as his siblings. When Forbes estimated his net worth at roughly $3.3 billion, he offered no comment. His work on the Campbell board was similarly understated. He served for more than 3 decades, from 1989 to 2022, attending meetings in Camden with the regularity of a man who treated the obligation as non-negotiable. He did not give speeches about the company's direction. He did not publicly challenge management or stage boardroom confrontations. He voted, he consulted, and he ensured that the Dorrance family's interests were represented at every critical juncture. When activist investors pressed the company to consider strategic alternatives, Bennett was part of the family bloc that held firm. In 2022, he stepped down from the board and handed the seat to his son, Bennett Dorrance Jr. The transition mirrored what Mary Alice would do 3 years later, passing her seat to her own daughter. A pattern was forming. The third generation was yielding to the fourth, and the mechanism was the same each time. A board seat moved from parent to child, carrying with it the unspoken expectation that the new director would protect what the family had built. Bennett's contribution to the dynasty was not dramatic. There were no 87 Grand Prix victories, no Georgian townhouses in Dublin, no front-page congressional hearings. What he provided was continuity. For more than 30 years, he sat between the family members who wanted to sell and the ones who wanted to hold, between the cousins who had lost interest and the siblings who cared too much, and he kept the structure from collapsing. It was the kind of work that no one notices until it stops being done. The Dorrance fortune required someone like Bennett, not a visionary, not a rebel, not a horseman, a manager, Someone willing to fly to Camden 4 times a year, sit in a conference room, review the numbers, and fly home. Someone willing to pick up the phone when a cousin in Connecticut wanted to liquidate her shares and talk her out of it. Someone willing to be the default leader because the alternative was no leader at all. By the time he handed the seat to his son, the family still controlled roughly a third of the company. It was less than the 59% they had held when Jack died. But it was enough. Enough to block a hostile takeover. Enough to influence the board. Enough to ensure that the name Dorrance still carried weight in Camden. That outcome was not inevitable. It was the result of decades of unglamorous, largely invisible work. And most of that work had been done by the youngest of Jack's 3 children, sitting in a house in Paradise Valley, making calls that no one outside the family would ever hear about. Chapter 12. Warhol's Can. In the summer of 1962, a 33-year-old commercial illustrator named Andy Warhol exhibited 32 small canvases at the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles. Each painting depicted a single can of Campbell's condensed soup, one for every variety the company sold: tomato, chicken noodle, cream of celery, pepper pot. They were displayed on a narrow wooden shelf that ran the length of the gallery wall, arranged like products on a supermarket aisle. The art world did not know what to make of them. A gallery across the street placed actual Campbell's cans in its window and sold them for 60 cents apiece, mocking the idea that a soup can belonged in an exhibition. Critics dismissed the show as shallow, a stunt, a joke at the expense of anyone who took it seriously. Sales were poor. The gallery's co-owner, Irving Blum, ultimately decided to keep the entire set himself. He paid $1,000 for all 32 paintings. 34 years later, he sold them to the Museum of Modern Art in New York for $15 million. Warhol had not chosen Campbell's at random. He said he used to have the same lunch every day for 20 years. The red and white can was the most familiar object in his kitchen, and familiarity was the point. By painting it with the precision of a commercial draftsman and hanging it in a fine art gallery, he forced a question that had no comfortable answer. Where does commerce end and culture begin? Is a soup can art if you put it on a shelf in a gallery? Is it still a product if you put it on a wall in a museum? The questions were not rhetorical. They changed the direction of American art. Before Warhol, the dominant movement was abstract expressionism. Painters like Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, who celebrated the individual gesture, the visible brushstroke, the artist as tortured genius. Warhol rejected all of it. He traced projected images onto canvas with the mechanical precision of an advertising layout. He smoothed away every trace of his own hand. The soup cans looked almost printed. That was deliberate. If mass production had come to define American life, then art should look like mass production too. What Warhol almost certainly did not know was the story behind the label he was painting. The red and white design had been chosen in 1898 by a Campbell executive named Herberton Williams, who had attended a football game at Cornell University and admired the team's colors. The gold medallion stamped into the center of the label commemorated a bronze medal the company had won at the 1900 Paris Exposition. Both details were more than 60 years old when Warhol set up his easel. The label had barely changed in all that time. It was already an artifact of American commercial history before it became an artifact of American art. The irony deepened over the decades. In 1962, Warhol was struggling for recognition, desperate to break out of the commercial illustration work that paid his bills, but earned no respect from the art establishment. Campbell's, by contrast, was one of the most successful companies in America, its cans stacked in every grocery store in the country. By the end of the century, the balance had shifted. Warhol's paintings of soup cans were worth more, per square inch, than anything the Campbell Soup Company had ever produced. The copy had become more valuable than the original. When visitors go to Warhol's grave in Bethel Park, Pennsylvania, they do not leave flowers. They leave cans of Campbell's soup. Tomato, mostly. The cans sit on the headstone, rain-spotted and sun-faded, placed there by strangers who understand that the gesture means something even if they cannot quite explain what. It is tribute and joke and cultural commentary all at once. Warhol would have appreciated that. He spent his career blurring the line between sincerity and irony, and in death the blur continues. The red and white label that a company executive copied from a college football uniform more than a century ago hangs in the most prestigious modern art museum in the world. The medallion from Paris is still on the can. The design is still on the shelf. And somewhere between the grocery store and the gallery wall, a 10-cent can of condensed soup became the most recognized image in American pop art. And the Dorrances never commissioned the paintings. They never asked for them. They never needed to. The can spoke for itself. Chapter 13. $15 billion of soup. In November of 2024, the company changed its name. It was no longer the Campbell Soup Company. It was now the Campbell's Company. The apostrophe and the dropped word were small adjustments, but they reflected a business that had expanded far beyond the product that built it. The company that John Thompson Dorrance had shaped around a single can of condensed soup now generated $9.6 billion in annual revenue and owned brands that included Pepperidge Farm, Goldfish, V8, Swanson, Pace, and Prego. It remained headquartered in Camden, New Jersey, in the same city where a 24-year-old chemist had once set up a laboratory and offered to work for $7.50 a week. The growth had come in waves. Pepperidge Farm was acquired in 1961. Pace Foods followed. In 2018, Campbell paid $6.1 billion for Snyder's-Lance, the maker of Cape Cod chips and Kettle Brand. In 2024, it added Sovos Brands for $2.9 billion, bringing Rao's pasta sauce into the portfolio. Each acquisition pushed the company further from soup and closer to the model of a diversified packaged food conglomerate. The red and white can was still on the shelf, but it was no longer the center of the business. The Dorrance family no longer held a majority of the shares. Decades of estate settlements, stock sales, and generational dilution had reduced the combined family stake to roughly 33%. It was a fraction of the 59% they had controlled when Jack died in 1989. But through strategic board positions and coordinated voting, the descendants of the inventor still exercised more influence over the company than any other group. Bennett Dorrance Jr. sat on the board. Mary Alice Malone Jr. had joined after her mother's death. Ippy remained in Dublin, a billionaire several times over, no longer a shareholder but still connected to the dynasty by name. There were now approximately 87 living descendants of John Thompson Dorrance. They were scattered across 3 countries. Some had never met. A few had never visited the headquarters. The family that had once gathered at the Greenbrier in matching red and white bandanas now communicated, when it communicated at all, through lawyers and trust officers. And yet the instruction that their patriarch had written into a 35-page will nearly a century ago still echoed through every boardroom vote and every quarterly earnings call. Do not sell. Do not lose control. Pass the fortune forward. 3 generations had obeyed, each in their own way. The grandfather had built the company and refused every offer to take it public. His son Jack had served as chairman for 22 years and never diversified the family holdings. Jack's children had split into 3 directions, one to Ireland, one to the horse farms of Pennsylvania, one to the desert of Arizona, but all 3 had kept their shares or ensured their seats passed to the next generation. The 4th generation was now in place. Bennett Jr. in Scottsdale, Mary Alice Jr. in Chester County, Ippy's sons in Europe. They had inherited not just money, but an obligation that none of them had chosen and none of them could easily refuse. The will did not merely distribute assets. It imposed a purpose, and the weight of that purpose, the expectation that each generation would sacrifice something to keep the company whole, had shaped every major decision the family had made since 1930. The can remains, red on top, white on the bottom, the medallion from Paris still pressed into the label. 128 years after a young chemist figured out how to remove the water from a pot of soup, his invention still sits on shelves in kitchens across America. It costs more than 10 cents now, but the design is almost unchanged. The script is still cursive. The gold medal is still there. The question the Dorrances have never been able to settle is whether the family can hold together as long as the can has. 3 generations have tried. A 4th is now in position. The fortune stands at $15 billion. The will says hold. The instinct, as 2 men named John Thompson Dorrance proved in 2 different centuries, says protect it at all costs. Whether those 2 impulses can coexist for another generation is the only question left.